begin the session. Dr. Friday, if you could unmute.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, for many of you joining us from around the Caribbean, a very warm welcome. We're here today with a number of speakers to talk about a Caribbean blue economy for diverse and sustainable livelihoods. We have a number of well-versed speakers on this topic. And before introducing them, I'd just like to say a few remarks. First of all, my name is Angus Friday. I serve as the Blue Economy Director at the Waitt Institute. And the Waitt Institute is focused on the 30 by 30 objectives, working with island nations around the world to help them implement large-scale marine protected areas through proper marine spatial planning. And we also give them support with the blue economy. Before speaking about today's session, we'd just like to, on behalf of the organizers, and I think behalf of all the panelists and all of us here, ready to express our concern and solidarity with the people of Haiti for the tragic events unfolding overnight with the assassination of the president. So our hearts go out to hearts and prayers go out to all people in Haiti at this time. The Caribbean has come through a very difficult period. We're still going through a difficult period with the pandemic. And there are lots of concerns for sustainability, lots of concerns for livelihoods and getting the economy back together. The Caribbean in particular, compared with other regions around the world, has been especially hard hit because of the detrimental impact that the pandemic has had on the tourism industry and what this has meant for livelihoods around the Caribbean. Across the region, however, there's a sense of hope. Many people are looking at the blue economy and blue recovery as a potential set of options for guiding the economy back and getting people back to work. A couple of key things guiding questions as we go through our panel. First of all, we see that human well-being is a very key part of the SDGs, particularly as it relates to equitable economies and equity amongst nations. So what should the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean we mean politicians, policymakers, institutions, private sector, NGOs, civil society, communities. What should we be doing to optimize the health of oceans and ensuring the equitable use of those resources, not just now, but also for future generations using a blue economy approach? Secondly, we know that the ocean has the ability to contribute tremendously to not only to livelihoods, but of course, environmental services, and of course, to food security. But against that backdrop, we have challenges such as plastic waste, untreated water, and a number of assaults, if you like, for marine ecosystems. So what can we be doing to better balance the needs of marine ecosystems, given some of these challenges that they face? And thirdly, in the European Union, we see that countries are taking a natural capital approach to the blue economy and to blue growth, with focus on things like mariculture, offshore wind, and so. In Oceania, on the other hand, we see a very community-oriented approach, and so we're keen to understand, where should the Caribbean be going? How should we position ourselves as we move forward, looking at the blue economy? One, as we think about how we get past the pandemic, how we live with COVID, how we deal with the fallout of COVID, the need for diversity of industry and jobs and so forth, as we think about conserving the ecosystems that we rely on today and that will help our future generations. So how do we balance all of these things, and how do we ensure a thriving blue economy? I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Justin Ram is no stranger to many of you. Dr. Ram is now the CEO of the Justin Ram Advisory and Associates and GSEC. And Dr. Ram has really helped to lead the Caribbean on so many levels in terms of the blue economy, not only with the current work he is doing, but also in his previous role. So Dr. Ram, Justin as I call him if we may, is an international economist with over 25 years of experience and practical advisory, research and management experience. He has worked as an economist for in over 32 countries across the Caribbean, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. His specializations include environmental and natural resource economics and climate change economics. Justin has a diploma in executive management from Stanford University and a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He holds an MSc in economics from the University College London and a BSc from the University of the West Indies and a postgraduate certificate in sustainable environmental management from the University of California in Berkeley. Dr. Ram, we'd like to now over to you as our first speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Friday, and we of course are very familiar with one another, so I'll say Angus. I also want to say a special thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to be part of it, and it's a great pleasure. Before I kick off my remarks, I also want to pay my respects to the family of the now deceased president of Haiti and to the people of Haiti. I would just like to say that I think this is yet another reminder of why all of us cannot ignore risks. And we have to be actively involved in this world that we're in. I think COVID has taught us that. And here's yet another lesson for us. So with that in mind, let me just start off by saying a few remarks around the blue economy based on my observations and certainly research and work that I've been doing over a number of years. But first of all, I just want to really put this into context. We are coming off, as Angus said, a very difficult period as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Caribbean, which has economies that are primarily tourism-based and so service-based, have been amongst the worst affected in the world due to the medical measures that had to be implemented in order to save lives and to save lives during this time. In fact, when you look at the data, tourism-based economies, along with war and economies that are in strife, are the ones that have suffered the worst. So that also tells us something about how vulnerable our economies are to any type of shock, be it economic, social, environmental, of course, and now we know how vulnerable we are to any type of a health shock. And in fact, as Angus said before, I was at the Caribbean Development Bank, and while there, staff and I looked at some of the trajectories for the prospects for the Caribbean. And what we did find that if you looked at the trajectory for the Caribbean economies from what we're experiencing now, and you sort of it extrapolated that out into the future, the Caribbean was on a trajectory to become, if not the worst, one of the poorest countries, regions in the world. And so why I'm saying this is that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were in a difficult spot. Like I mentioned before, we know that we're vulnerable to economic shocks. We are vulnerable to social shocks. We're now vulnerable to health. And we certainly know that we're vulnerable to environmental shocks. In fact, I was saying to myself and my close friends only last weekend, being based in Barbados, I've now in the space of maybe 18 months experienced a pandemic. I've experienced volcanic ashfall from a nearby volcano, and I recently experienced a Category 1 hurricane. And so from that perspective, you know that we have a lot of work to do to build on how do we make our economies resilient. And so that is where the whole idea of big ocean developing states, as we like to call ourselves now, really comes in. So moving away from this notion of the small island developing states, understanding that our exclusive economic zones mean that our overall space is up to 80 times our land mass. So in speaking about how we can think about harnessing the blue economy to support livelihoods, I think it's really important for us to understand how we can perhaps exploit this considerable resource that we have lapping at our shores in a sustainable way, in a way that is climate friendly, and in a way that actually can boost current growth for current generations, but also maintain the stock of that resource for future generations. And I think that we can do this sustainably. I think there is a great example that I came across only a few months ago, whereby fisher folk in Barbados were commenting how bountiful the recent catch of flying fish was. But I don't think that many people sort of made the link between actually, because we were not fishing due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures that were put in place to stop the spread of the disease. Because of that, we weren't fishing. And so the fish were actually able to now rejuvenate. And so when the fisher folk went out there, they were able to have a very quite bountiful catch. And I think we have to be able to make that link, that it's not about trying to fish as much as you can on a day-to-day basis, but actually managing the resource in a way so that we can bring longevity to it. And so I think this whole notion of sustainable livelihoods is something that we have to consider. I also want to say that as we consider the blue economy and what impact it will have on livelihoods, now is the time for us in the region, for our policymakers to consider what are the necessary policies that we need to put in place in order to have a sustainable blue economy that will have a great and lasting impact on sustainable livelihoods. What are the types of infrastructure that will be required? What are the types of regulatory environments that are going to be required? And finally, I think what's going to be critical in all of this to make this a reality is the type of financing that we're able to bring to the table. But I just want to say that it's not about the public sector leading the charge here. I think more and more as we try to develop this new area of our economy that will bring sustainable livelihoods, it has to be private sector led. And when I say private sector led, I mean that from micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises all the way up to large financial institutions, working together not only in a public-private partnership, but in a public-private NGO partnership. This is a type of initiative that we want. Community-based partnerships where governments, private sector, and NGOs are all working together towards a sustainable blue economy. So I think, Angus, I will just like to leave it there. I think that we have to consider the types of policies that are going to be required, the infrastructure, the regulatory environment, as well as the finance that's going to bring to fruition and to reality the type of blue economy livelihoods that we want to see for current and future generations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ram, as always, very insightful and really providing both a sort of satellite view, but also an on-the-ground view, a number of considerations. Your mention of some of the practicalities of how the fishery population can rebound and what we need to be doing, public sector, private sector. So thank you very much for that. We'd like to come back to you on some of those points, Dr. Ram, in the discussion. Right now, we'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who is Mr. Craig Henry. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, which he joined in March of 2020. Mr. Henry brings a wealth of experience. He's no stranger to many of you. He's worked in the field of conservation for some time now, also working with the St. Lucia National Trust, a conservation-oriented NGO, and has collaborated and worked as a technical officer and mentor. He's collaborated with government agencies, international entities, NGOs, community groups, and so forth, really to promote the sustainable use of resources and sustainable livelihoods. He has also a wealth of experience and skills related to monitoring data and collection and designing and implementing projects and grants, sustainable finance, community outreach, and so forth. So here is someone who is very much working in communities, acting as a bridge, if you like, between international players, governments, and local communities. And so, Mr. Henry, we look forward to to your remarks and touching on some of the themes that you mentioned earlier when we spoke. So we're sort of keen to hear about in particular your view on how partnerships can help with all of this. So over to you, Mr. Henry.
Thank you very much, Angus, for your very articulate introduction. And again, as with everyone else, I'd like to express sentiments of support to the people and government of Haiti in the wake of the reported assassination of Haitian President Johannes Bautista, and especially to my counterparts, Jean-Baptiste Mohile of the Haitian Biodiversity Fund, and Nelly Gordon of Voyage, and my thoughts and prayers as of that of my secretariat and board at the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund with you all. In terms of my participation here today and what I would like to bring to the table, I would like to bring a perspective from our own St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, which was fully incorporated as a conservation trust fund in 2016, with a specific mission to secure and provide sustainable finance to support conservation, restoration, and effective management of St. Lucia's biodiversity and natural resources. So although the SLUNCF operates within and is part of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, which is coordinated by the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, the agency was designed to accommodate and manage a diverse range of funding flows, apart from its annual drawdowns from the Environment Fund managed by CBF. So given this broad mandate and the ability to explore various sustainable financial options, the SLUNCF has made it a policy to explore partnerships and collaborations that will allow it to pursue its core mission with a high degree of flexibility and perhaps, if you want, consistency and stability, which is our aim. So thus, let me highlight a special collaboration between the SLUNCF and a private sector actor in the name of the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association. That partnership was formalized from MOU that was established in 2019. And through this MOU, the SLUNCF was awarded a yearly monetary contribution, which in turn would be used by the SLUNCF to support both its operation and its grant making portfolio. And these funds came through what we call what is called the Tourism Enhancement Fund, which is a facility that was created by the SLHDA that would allow it to play an integral role in the sustainable development of St. Lucia as a tourism destination. So essentially, the TEF contributions came through voluntary donations by visitors, and of course that would permit the TEF or the SLHDA, in that matter, to support various initiatives that relate to either ecotourism or beautification, awareness, and even promoting sustainability in the industry. It is noteworthy that the SLUNCF has a similar MOU or arrangement with Massey Store St. Lucia for its environmental sustainability program. Of course, I harken back to last year when I joined the SLUNCF, and at that time, indeed, it was at the beginning, if you want to call it, of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which had both global and local impacts. And for tourism-dependent countries such as ours, the effects were immediate, given that global tourism and travel, which accounted for 43% of our GDP in 2019, all of these came to abrupt halt. And of course, you can imagine the fallout from that, the hotel closures, cruise ship cancellations, and more broadly, the impact on the economy, loss of employment, contraction in various economic activities, tourism-related, non-tourism related. And so what that meant for the SLUNCF, SLHDA, TEF contribution was a direct loss, as the agency, of course, was no longer to generate receipts, like all other institutions. Given the economic uncertainties that we all were grappling with, there was a decision, or there was, if you could say, a decision to hold off of giving further remit under our MOU. So in essence, what we had to do at the SLUNCF was think very strategically on how we could move forward, given that we had to consider not only our own viability during the course, that period of uncertainty, but also we did not want to abandon our core stakeholders, which were our grantees, and of course the wider mandate of biodiversity protection and conservation. So definitely, in the spirit of partnership and in the spirit of collaboration and understanding how very well communication is during these times, we did make it a point to communicate very actively and engage some major partners, and that included the CDF, some of our current donors, and even some folks, so like TEF and the Massey Stores, and even folks in our wider networks, REDLAC, which is a group of environmental funds from the Latin American and Caribbean. So these conversations really were to try to decide, on a way forward, how we could support each other. I must tell you as well that there were very intense and intricate conversation among the various regional NCTF network, NCTFs, conservation trust funds, I should say, that fall within the sustainable finance or Caribbean sustainable finance architecture. And primarily, we wanted to pursue to discuss how it is that we could support each other, coordinate our efforts, to see where we had joint interests and promote these areas so that we could not only sustain ourselves, but also provide some relief or some idea and make an input in recovery efforts, and of course, coordinate activities that could possibly lead us out on moving beyond the pandemic period. So I must also thank my colleagues who were very committed to these conversations, because these conversations led to other engagements with philanthropic organizations and with other major partners and stakeholders who, at the time, there was a very, high inclination to provide support in the first time that with the onset of the COVID. And given our own conversations, we recognized that the NCTF together could put together a series of programs. So we did, in fact, conceptualize, I must say, two nature-based solutions to support economic recovery, and that could help to build resilience in the region. And one of these regional programs in the first instance was offer solutions to the economic recovery after COVID and focuses on food security, food sovereignty, and livelihoods through the strategic investment in some nature-based activities. And these activities, of course, relate to some of the low-hanging fruit. But more importantly, and related to this topic, I think that we have a second program to explore and implement policies that would support the development of the blue economies across the Caribbean. What we wanted to do with this regional blue economy program was to be more focused on building the resilience of the coastal and marine ecosystems in the region for a series of community-based ecosystem restoration projects in order to secure ecosystem services, particularly in relation to livelihoods generation. And as Dr. Ram aptly put it, community-based activities are where you definitely make the most impact. And given that the stake that the ecologically dependent communities have, and given that most of our countries are what we call coastal dwellers, coastal economies, and so therefore it made sense that we focus or give some focus to an array of activities that we could provide support, not only in terms of funding, but seek to help to coordinate among ourselves and our partners in our national jurisdictions. So I don't want to, I will stay true to the time, and I say that there is an opportunity to discuss this further on as the panel or as the discussion moves on. So I thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. And it's very interesting to listen to how you've been able to pull together a lot of these partnerships and stakeholders at this very challenging time to sort of come up with solutions to keep things going on the ground. So I think we would like to come back to some of those themes. I'd just like to take stock of where we are at the moment. We've heard two of our speakers so far. We've heard Dr. Justin Ram and Craig Henry, and we're about to introduce our third speaker. Right now, we have about 134 listeners on the line listening in from around the Caribbean. I've seen folks in the chat from Jamaica, from Guyana, from Guadeloupe and Martinique, from St. Lucia, of course, and other places around the Caribbean, Bahamas, a number of other places. So just want to say a quick welcome to everybody. Great to have you here. We're here, of course, at this conference on Conservation Finance Congress because of the work of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. They have a bold vision, really, to have reliable long-term finance in conservation, And they have sort of two flagship programs. One is a conservation finance program anchored by a $75 million endowment fund. And the other is a climate change program anchored by a $27 million sinking fund for ecosystem-based adaptation. Our next speaker is Heidi Clark. Heidi Clark is the executive director of the Sandals Foundation, and she's going to be talking to us a little bit about and giving us a take on tourism. The Sandals Foundation, of course, is a philanthropic arm of the Sandals Resorts International, which focuses, of course, on developing the Caribbean and improving lives of its people through education, environment, and community. Heidi's primary responsibilities include managing development projects across 8 Caribbean islands. And she does this including by harnessing the power of volunteerism, activism, working with team members, guests, travel agents, local, regional, international partners, nonprofit organizations, and so forth. And they really effect life-changing programs that reach well beyond the doors of Sandals and beaches, all-inclusive resorts. Born and raised in Jamaica, Heidi has extensive experience in education, social services, and business management fields. She attended the University of Miami, where she studied child psychology and education. Heidi, the tourism sector has really been impacted more than anything else globally, of course, because of the pandemic. But here in the Caribbean, where we rely so much on tourism, as Dr. Justin Ram mentioned earlier, it's been particularly challenging. How do you see us moving forward from here, Heidi? And tell us a little bit about some of the approaches we should be taking from a blue economy perspective, and how you see the tourism industry fitting in. Heidi, over to you.
Good morning, Dr. Friday. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I would also like to mention that our thoughts and prayers are with the Haitian people this morning and the President's family. It's certainly a pleasure to join this much needed discussion on this inaugural Caribbean Conservation Finance Conference. I want to thank the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund for making this possible first and foremost. I think we've all recognized what has happened over the past year and continues to happen. I'm happy to say things are looking a little bit brighter, but we're all aware of how the tourism industry drives the economy here in the Caribbean, as well as our ability to both negatively and positively contribute to climate change, the protection of our biodiversity, and conservation of our coral and coastal marine resources. Of course, as we recover from this COVID-19 pandemic and seeing the impact of the last couple of hurricane seasons on our region, I think we can no longer look at business as usual. It's important that we all understand the value of the blue economy and the role we play in making it a reality. We have to recognize more than ever, the tourism industry isn't about selling a resort, it's about selling a destination. And that destination really is made of the people and the environment that make the Caribbean such a special place. Our resorts are located in coastal communities, so the health and well-being of those communities and the livelihoods in those communities, certainly we are dependent on those. To put it very bluntly, without the blue economy, there is no future for tourism. The Sandals Foundation is now 12 years old, but our company has been operating, it'll be 40 years this year, in 8 islands, and we're now about to move into 10. And we recognized over this period of time that we have the ability to work with governments, to tap into resources of our guests, our team members, our corporate partners, both locally and internationally, to manage and finance protected areas, and most critically, to spread awareness and education in our communities and in our schools for future generations to be impacted. Presently, just some of the programs that we do and have been successful at doing over the last 12 years, we run 2 marine sanctuaries here in Jamaica. We also contribute to another 5 of them, and those are run in conjunction with local communities and local fishermen. We have worked with partners to fund coral nurseries and fund training in both St. Lucia and Jamaica around coral conservation. We partner with organizations like the Bahamas National Trust to finalize their primary school curriculum, and also with the EAG in Antigua for floating classrooms, just to ensure that we're putting marine and environmental education at the forefront of what is important here. We partner with organizations like the Grenada Fund for Conservation and UNEP, with a major focus on getting coastal communities involved in mangrove planting and solid waste management. Really and truly, at the end of the day, we are working to utilize our brand name and tourism dollars to offer guests and our team members opportunities through various mechanisms, such as eco-friendly tours, gift shop items that give back, everything from opting in to donate or volunteer on conservation projects, and of course, our specialized dives that we now have going, and that's offered in all the islands where we operate. These activities not only bring awareness to the blue economy and what we're doing, but it also brings funding to projects and programs that impact the blue economy. Our goal really is about leading by example, sharing best practices, and then scaling up what we've been able to do. And scaling it up by working with partners, stakeholders such as government, experts in the field, and of course, other private sector and tourism sector players. It's said, Dr. Friday, you said it, and it's been said by Dr. Ram, it is about the private sector being very integral in what is taking place. We have the ability, we have the force to go in and to make huge differences by trying to work on policy and work directly, locally on the ground in the communities that surround us. So I look forward to further dialogue today and in the future to see how we can continue to play our part and scale up what we have been doing. Thanks again for having us here today.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And it's just great to hear the tremendous work that your organization is undertaking. And I was very intrigued as well to hear about some of the coral work that's being undertaken. Because of course, this is vital for sort of ecosystem-based adaptation as well. Colleagues, in my earlier remarks, I mentioned, one of the main sponsors for, and Andrea, I think you have your, if I can ask you to mute. Thank you. We spoke about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. In addition to that, of course, there's the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, and you can find them at sluncf.org to learn more about a lot of the exciting work that they're doing in terms of ecosystem-based conservation and sustainability. Colleagues, thank you so much for all of the interventions that we've had. I think a number of extremely good points coming out. And one of the challenges we see here now, this is a particularly tough time for governments where fiscal space is very limited. They haven't been able to collect the taxes that they would normally collect. The tourism industry has suffered. Fishing has suffered as well, because in some of the main markets, people aren't going out to restaurants, as they have. And this has had a huge impact on livelihoods. We heard from Craig at the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund what they're doing in terms of bringing a whole range of stakeholders together to be able to move the needle forward. I think one of the challenges we have right now for governments in particular is that where they are constrained fiscally because of, they haven't been pulling in the revenues that they've been able to pull in. How do we now convince multiplicity of stakeholders, governments, private sector, communities, to give focus to conservation, to give focus to protecting marine ecosystems? How do we do that practically, and how do we help them to fund and finance that, given some of the challenges at the moment, given limited fiscal space, etc.? And I want to share with you some of the approaches that we know others around the world are considering at this time. And it would be useful to, before we start inviting sort of questions, I just want to sort of lead off with, with some general observations. We see that a number of countries, for example, because of limited fiscal space, because of concerns as to whether or not they'd be able to meet debt payments. My dog has a slightly different view on this point, but I'll persist nonetheless. Because they have difficulties in meeting debt payments, we find that sovereign credit rating, might be slipping. Some entities are looking at this as an opportunity for carrying out, for example, looking at debt for nature swaps. In other places where sovereign credit ratings remain high, people are looking at blue bonds and the like. And we saw just before the pandemic, things like green bonds, there's really a surge in green bonds globally, for example. So it would be keen to, understand how, you see some of these instruments being used to help finance practically some of this work. Also, we have new developments coming on stream. There's a lot more crowdfunding which can be done now through the internet. And in addition to that, we see a lot of new innovations coming up in terms of blockchain and in Eastern Caribbean moving to digital cash and so forth. So be keen to understand how you see, if we think of COVID as a disruptor, which is creating space for new types of, for governments and private sector to consider new types of instruments, how you see these playing a potential role, either for governments or private sector or for communities. Just looking through the, so this is just one set of thoughts, if you will, for discussion. We also, Justin, I'd like to ask you to respond to that, but we have a number of questions here that we're also seeing in the Q&A. For example, how is the value of tourism to GDP calculated? What is the percentage in relation to other sectors? Are other sectors involved in conservation support? One anonymous attendee said, I think Dr. Ram is correct. That is not public sector alone, but do you think that defining this new process with ocean resources under a more formal title of blue economy, we create a limitation for non-government actors being involved in this new area? Another anonymous attendee said, Sandals were involved in bidding to build a resort in Tobago on one of the most diverse areas of flora and fauna ecosystems, which would have been disastrous for the island. Was there due diligence before this bid was submitted? So that's a number of questions there. But I'd like to perhaps start by just opening up the floor a little bit. Dr. Ram, if I can start with you to sort of share some of your perspectives on these.
Sure, Angus. So you want me to answer these questions that are in the question and answers?
Yeah, and also, if you just share any reflections in terms of where we are now and your thoughts based on what others have said. Just to get us start us off.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And well, before I sort of delve into some of these questions that I'm seeing in the question and answer segment here, I wanted to reflect on something that you said, Angus, earlier. And I think that we have come to a point in time where we as Caribbean people really need to reconsider our social contract. Our social contract currently as it is now is based on a certain form of governance, which perhaps was useful for us as we came out of that immediate post-colonial era. So as we came out of that independence, we had a social contract for most of us based on a Westminster type of governance system, which worked for us well for a while. But I think we all have to admit, and I think that this is one of the most important things, that when you have a challenge, you have to admit when you have a problem. And I think we have a governance problem, which also means that we have a social contract problem. So I think one of the things we need to do here, and it goes beyond the blue economy, is that we need to consider what sort of new social contract we need to see. I think that it is imperative at this point in time that we move away from a social contract where the government is a driving force for economic growth, and many people are dependent on the government for doing things to facilitate their livelihoods. I think what has to happen now is that government needs to pull back. We know that they no longer have the fiscal space to do many things that they want to, but they need to now facilitate, improve the business environment. We need to get more companies like Sandals doing what they do, investing in blue economy, and of course, getting them more involved in the sustainable development and supporting livelihoods across the Caribbean. And I think if we're able to do this, Angus, we can see much greater linkages between certain sectors and the rest of the economy. And as we consider now exploiting the blue economy in a sustainable way, I think that this has to be an imperative for us, that we form our social contract, we form our governance, say that it has to be a system now whereby we are leading the charge from a sort of a bottom up. And this is why I say that we really need partnerships, not only this triple P of public-private partnerships, but there's partnerships between the private sector, the government, communities, NGOs, individuals, households. How do we get everybody involved? Because if we want to make a success of the blue economy, I think it's very important for us to understand that the way how we do things now isn't going to work. So I just want to say that if I just jump into some of these questions that I'm seeing here, how is the value of tourism to GDP calculated? Well, just to answer this, Joanne, if I'm saying the name correctly, what tends to happen is that we calculate what's called a tourism satellite account, which tends to look at all of the activities that are associated not only directly with tourism, but also indirectly as it relates to, so for example, when someone visits the island of Jamaica, they are not only just going to stay in a hotel in Jamaica at Sandals, they also need to get transport from the airport to the hotel, but then Sandals might then be purchasing goods and services from other aspects of the economy. And so we try to measure all of this through what's called a tourism satellite account. And I should say that before I left the Caribbean Development Bank, we also did what's called a blue economy satellite account for Jamaica. And that is something that I think we have to consider looking at doing for all of our economies if we want to make a success of the blue economy. Because as you know, Angus and everyone on this call, that unless you are measuring things, you're really not going to put the type of focus. So that accountability becomes important. And so I think we also need to be able to measure the blue economy. And we can do that similarly to how we've been doing that for tourism through a satellite account. And we have developed that already for Jamaica for a blue economy satellite account. I will just go down to maybe this other question here. And I think I mentioned something around the public sector. It's not only the public sector alone, but we need to consider how we include the private sector, NGOs, communities. And again, that just comes back to my point that how do we get away from what this anonymous attendee is asking here around creating limitations for non-government actors? I think that there's a fundamental shift that is required in terms of reorienting our social contract to one that now changes the way we are governed and make sure that we have what's called real democracy at work. There is something called citizen assemblies, which means that before any policy becomes final, that citizens really have an opportunity to discuss what is required and ensure that in some way benefits are maximized, but not only benefits are maximized, but that the benefits are distributed widely. I think that this is a new approach that we have to take. Let me just restate this, that I think now is a time for us to really look at private sector-led growth. That has to be very, 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 very important for us. And when I say private sector-led growth, I don't only mean private sector in the terms of large corporations. I mean micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises as well. We need to bring all of this into the fold if we are going to see a type of sustainable development that we want to see in the blue economy. So Angus, I'll just hand it back there to you. I don't think I should answer the other questions, which are certainly much more natural science oriented.
So I believe that Dr. Friday has lost connection and will be back with us shortly, I hope. In the meantime, I'm not sure, Justin, if there were any other questions that you might want to tackle, or if any of the other speakers had some, and hopefully Dr. Friday will be back with us in a minute.
Sure, I'll come off. I think there's some questions there certainly that Heidi should be able to answer. Okay.
I did see the question about Tobago. Obviously, it is something that we do due diligence on any project that we get involved with from all aspects. And that is done, in conjunction with our projects teams who are in charge of the construction, but our operations and how our daily operations will impact a specific region. And then, of course, we are working very closely with environmental agencies and experts on the ground. So if a project is viable, it is certainly something that is done prior to that. So we do recognize that space. It's actually, I lived in Tobago for 12 years. I'm very familiar with this space and worked very closely with the Buku Reef Trust. And so I think that that project has not gone forward, but it is something we are always cognizant of.
So if I may, coming up and address, make a point on and expand on a little bit on some of the points that Dr. Ram raised with respect to how it is that we can get the private sector or the growth post-COVID to be private sector led. I think given that governments are fiscally unable to, or they have some fiscal restrictions. One of the issues, or one of the things I think that the governments can do is to create the kind of space whereby, in terms of governance, we can get more participation from civil society and from the private sector. So whereas we want to create both the legislative and policy environment that will allow participation and as wide as possible. But we also want to ensure that in terms of governance of some of our natural and coastal marine resources, there's the ability of local communities to participate in some of the decision making and to influence the way that some of these resources are used, of course, in a sustainable manner. And so one of the things that I do definitely promote and I've seen and possibility that can go forward, so certain co-management agreements with communities or groups, for perhaps set of mangroves or a particular coastal area, These co-management arrangements can be made in such that there is recognition of the importance of both the communities, given that they're dependent on this ecosystem for livelihoods, but also recognizing that there's a conservation aspect to it, and of course this can be built in such arrangements. The SMMA, the Sulphur Marine Management Area, is a very good example, of course, of a setup, governance structure that was put together and set up with the participation of many stakeholders. It was hailed as a success, and it is undergoing, obviously, improvements as situations change. But again, it is providing opportunities for participation, especially where you want to create create what is called ownership. Some people would say stewardship at the ground level or grassroots level. The SLUNCF, of course, listen to add, the idea of collaborations is key, given that many agencies, private, civil society do have resources, but sometimes we operate in silos. So last year, what we attempted to do was try to see if we could map out and try to harmonize some of these resources, see what all of us were doing, and then see how we could move jointly in addressing certain matters. Co-funding is a very important one as well, and providing resource support where it is needed. So one of the examples that, and something that we'll be working on, is that Jeff SGP Small Grants Program in St. Lucia does finance a number of grassroots or community-based projects, and these nature-based activities do have the potential to support livelihoods, but obviously have a conservation aim. And therefore, what we try to do is we have to analyze or see where we can create most impact, and providing the extra support, not only in terms of financing, but capacity and having the right policy environment can bring about the kind of results that we're anticipating. And especially in terms of trying to launch or trying to take advantage of this new era where there seems to be an inclination to do things differently, not the business as usual, then I think we need to take advantage of it. While again, it cannot be government-led, but I don't want us to miss the point that, administrations really can change the tide on certain movements if there's not the political will to move forward. And so we have to encourage our decision makers, our permanent secretaries, our ministers, to be involved, to educate them properly, and to perhaps speak in a manner that will help them to understand what are the benefits of, if not providing fiscal support, but creating that kind of policy environment, having or investing in the kind of legislative governance structures that will allow the participation and, of course, the materialization of some of these projects or programs, nature-based programs and investments that would flourish and to the benefit of the communities and the countries in general.
Thank you, Craig, and good morning to everyone. My name is Johannes Bautista. I'm the CEO of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. Dr. Angus Friday had some technology issues, so I'm stepping in for him as backup moderator for the remaining of this session. It's been really great to hear all your answers, and thank you for also jumping in to answer right away questions from our audience this morning. I personally have a question for the three of you. You all addressed the issue of coming up with blue economy strategies, and you talked about policies, you talked about community level engagement, you have talked about private sector engagement, particularly from a tourism angle. But given how dependent the whole Caribbean region is on really a true healthy and sustainable blue economy, what would be your perspective on how Caribbean countries can work together regionally with a regional approach to really promote that blue economy that is so required for all of us. Our countries, ecosystems don't respect boundaries. We all know that. We are a very densely island populated region. We have over 34 countries and territories in the insular Caribbean, and we are really very close together. So how can we work closely to promote a true regional approach for the blue economy?
Yeah, but I just want to say, something that was spoken about so much yesterday was about having the plan and about having not just the blue economy plan, but also the financial plan. And that is at the national level, but also at the regional level. And I think until there is that network working together to have that plan, we are going to have a much harder time accessing financing for this. So I think the plan, in order to change policies and to move it forward, needs to be the forefront of what we are doing and how we are moving forward in this region.
Yeah, I will also just add to that it comes back to this whole point of, I'm an economist, I'll speak about the economy here. We know what the size of the Jamaican economy is. We know what the size of the Trinidad and Tobago economy is. We know what the size of the St. Lucian, Barbadian economy is. And we might think that we add all of those together, and I haven't named all the countries, of course. If we add all of those together, we get the size of the Caribbean economy. But there's something that is always missing in that type of assessment, is that we don't do a sort of economic interlinkages between the various economies. So, for example, when a project is done in Jamaica, it certainly has a great impact on the domestic Jamaican economy, but also has impacts in other places as well. And I think we now have a great opportunity with the blue economy, if we're now going to advocate for a regional approach, that we develop a blue economy measurement framework that incorporates a regional aspect to it. So we understand all of these linkages. So what does that mean? And it's not only about the dollars and cents, but it's also about the biodiversity, about the resources that are within there. So, for example, if I am extracting fish in a Barbadian ecosystem, how is that also having an impact on the ecosystems in other places? And as you said earlier, is that we know that ecosystems do not obey man-made boundaries. But I think for us, we need to really understand that. And I think it just comes back again that, as Carrie come, and I come back to this point, that we need to reorient. We need to say enough is enough. We need to make significant changes so that we can get our regional integration movement moving in the direction that we need to. Without it, we're going to stay singular. And I'm afraid that if we stay singular and we stay individualistic, we're probably all going to suffer some type of a demise. I'm not saying that we need to come together all under one government, but I think we need to work much more closer together in a harmonious way. And just to reiterate my point, I think one of the ways to do that is for us to understand, if we measure it properly, what that means for all of us. And that comes back to a real micro level, to the livelihoods, because what I do in Trinidad and Tobago's waters could really have an impact on livelihoods in Barbados and in Grenada. And we need to have that joined up approach to that, to the thought process. And I think that would focus policymakers, the electorate minds on why we need to do this regionally.
Thank you so much for those views, Heidi and Dr. Ram. I believe we have Dr. Angus Friday back with us, but maybe to allow him to catch up with the conversation, I'm gonna put to the panel two questions, and then Angus, I will turn back to you as moderator, and I'll remain as backup moderator if needed.
If you may permit me, before we move on,
sure.
I'd just like to
Go
add
ahead,
that
Craig.
there are already ongoing some, in recognition of the fact that we have a shared space, marine space, by biodiversity in the Caribbean. I am aware that there are already some regional projects that are trying to see how we can best coordinate and harmonize our policies with regards to the use of marine resources and so on and so forth. I know that there is the OECS ECROP project, and of course, there is also the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. I think that has to do with spatial planning, institutionalizing and strengthening marine protected areas and sustainable fisheries activities. And of course, again, it's in recognition that for too long we have seen ourselves as individuals and as unit islands, and forget that the species and biodiversity and even the challenges with managing marine biodiversity cross boundary. So the interest, therefore, and the proposals that I'm seeing put forward is in recognition of that, where the economics of it is something, I'm not an economist, so this is something that I would leave to the specialists, but then, or the experts, but then I would also say that the recognition, the fact that it's recognized that, let us say, you mentioned flying fish just now, that we did recognize even before the COVID that we were seeing less and less flying fish in, let us say, Eastern Caribbean waters, but the flying fish had moved away. It wasn't the fact that there were no flying fish, it's just that we were not managing and we were not observing that flying fish were had moved to specific grounds where there was more favorable. So it's in recognition of all, taking into consideration all these factors that may impact how our marine resources are affected. I give support to the idea of a regional approach to marine management, marine planning, and of course, governance as well.
Thank you, Craig. And maybe the one question which is related to some of your points. One of our members from the audience is asking what grant opportunities are there in the region to support either research or pilot projects that are geared towards establishing a blue economy. And Craig, of course, you come from a conservation trust fund. You often work on those kinds of project grant making opportunities, but perhaps others in the panel can also talk to this question. And I will now turn off my screen while you answer that and allow Angus to come back as moderator. Thank you.
Craig, over to you on that one.
Okay, also yes. So definitely there are opportunities in terms, in fact, for different players. As a matter of fact, we need investors, we need planners, we need people and ideas as to how best to move forward. This is something I should say akin to when we were exploring the ideas behind the green economy, and we noted that yes, it was all we saw all the benefit of it, but then in fact of the practical reality of it, we didn't make much headway. So it is with the blue economy. One of the things that I always stress is that we have to understand how practical it is for us. So how can we implement, what is the way forward? And I think we need to take some time to actually map this out. We need to also recognize what the resources that it will require in terms of not just financing, but our own capacity, what is the legislative framework that we have to operate in. And take stock of what are the things that we are already doing that are blue economy related, that we can perhaps upscale or scale out. So for instance, I'll give a very simple one. Cmos Production in St. Lucia was traditionally done in a small scale, in terms of beverages. But over the years, we've realized that the Cmos is a very versatile, if you want to call it, marine product. And even during the pandemic, what we experienced or what we observed in St. Lucia was that there was this massive expansion in Cmos farms being established along St. Lucia and eastern coastal waters and so on and so forth. That now you can see that both as an opportunity in terms of opportunities for people who are unemployed or people who work on needed something extra money. And given that there is a high demand for CMOS on the global market, but then it also presents challenges in terms of management of the marine space, whereby you have regular folks who want to make or to earn a living going and establishing CMOS farms in all spaces. And of course, this causes conflict among other users. So all that tells you is that, yeah, one of the things that we have to take stock of is that we have to monitor how, moving forward, how we propose things to happen. There's planning that has to take place, there's support, there's capacity building, and then there's an education. But then always remember, it comes back to the community. What are discussions that we're having on the ground? Are we putting, or are we forwarding practical proposals? Are we being realistic in terms of our objectives and our goals? And of course, are we having the right kinds of engagements, be it at the ground level or when we speak of senior management, or even at the regional level? Again, taking us back to the idea of a regional approach to blue economy planning.
Thank you very much for that, Craig. Very much appreciated. I'd just like to sort of marry two of the points that were just being made. You know, one is looking at you know, what it means on the ground for example, a CMOS farmer, and sort of link that a little bit to the regional approach. But before doing so, I'd just like to take stock of the fact that in addition to some of the countries that I mentioned earlier, we also have people from Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Belize, Havana in Cuba, from Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, Dominican Republic, Montserrat, and also seeing folks from Marshall Islands, from Miami, and from Austin, Texas. So welcome all. We're talking about conservation finance. We're talking about linking that to the blue economy. And we're also, I think, in the latest part of the discussion now, looking at what sort of regional approaches we can take. It's great to see this sort of regional participation we have right now. And let's say congratulations to the organizers for pulling us together for this type of discussion. I think one of the challenges, Yaba, many thanks for stepping in while we had some technical challenges. And just to one of the points you were making, Yaba, is, you know, one of the challenges now, you know, for the regional approach is, you know, really getting this onto the agenda at a time when, you know, governments are hugely constrained, you know, given the challenges of COVID. And then if you turn to the private sector is also hugely constrained. This is not business as usual. You know, if you're in the tourism industry, you're trying to hold on to some of your employees, perhaps. You may have had to let go a number of employees. So there's just not a lot of room for you know, either governments or from private sectors to finance some of these activities without, I think, a determined effort and some sort of a framework. So I think it's great that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has been one of the initiatives really to get the Caribbean to think you know, about conservation, but also to have the instrument ready to go to help finance this. I think to get, you know, even either from governments or bottom up, I think there needs to be some, it helps if there's either a massive groundswell of a bottom up approach to put pressure on governments, you know, to prioritize this, you know, or if there's an initiative started either by, you know, private sector or otherwise to help government to consolidate around this. For example, you know, what would happen if we didn't do the right things? How would the tourism industry feel if we just saw, you know, continued degradation, for example, of corals and fish stocks, natural environment? You know, what would that mean for the tourism industry? People come, less likely to come to the Caribbean. So Heidi, this is something that I'd like you to think about, and the extent to which, for example, some sort of coalition in the tourism industry can, help governments to sort of see their way through this and to give this some priority. Because at the end of the day, everyone is thinking about jobs. How do we get more people employed? How can we be using, for example, ecosystem-based adaptation, whether with coral or mangrove? How can that drive jobs? And what is the model to actually pay for all of that? To finance jobs. I know this is some of the work that the Biodiversity Fund, for example, is looking at. But how can we, how can we bring that message to bring a sort of consolidated agenda? I think on the agenda of either CARICOM or the OECS. OECS is doing a lot of work on this, of course. But if there's a disconnect between things like marine spatial planning and jobs, if governments don't see, where the jobs are coming from, it's less likely that, they're going to want to give this, focus. So Heidi, Craig, Justin, any comments on that before we revert to, I'm going to have a look to see what other questions we have, but just like to get your responses to that.
Sure, Dr. Friday, I think that more than ever, and this was spoken about a few times, about the fact that it's almost about marketing this issue and getting more people on board, whether it's government, other tourism players, but maybe the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund needs to look at that as something that needs to be invested in, the marketing of how this blue economy is impacting, not just the 500,000 jobs that are directly in the tourism industry, but all the other areas that are connected to it. I think that if people understood more and they bought into the value and understood that value and how we are all stakeholders, that will help to bring more people on board. So I think there definitely needs to be more dialogue. Every one of us in the tourism industry have the ability to bring financing and awareness to this, but it is about, as you say, bringing us together. And I think now is a time more than ever. So how do we start that dialogue and how do we start this coalition? I think that may be something that, maybe Sandals Foundation can start that dialogue with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and see how we take it to the next level of awareness, because it's crucial.
Thank you. Justin, Craig, you want to come in on this?
Sure. I guess I'll just say, well, I'll just come back to my earlier point where I think there needs to be a sort of a fundamental shift in our thinking in terms of how we look at governance and our relationship with our governments. And I think this has to be a project that is sort of generational. It's going to take time for us, but I think we have come to a point whereby, look, we shouldn't be asking governments for permission to do what is right. I think that we hear many people understand what is required, and we need to have a system whereby governments are following the lead of the people. And so that's why I keep coming back to a system where that social contract really needs to change. How can governments now facilitate what we want? So Heidi's business is not going to continue to thrive if the blue economy is degraded to an extent where people don't want to come to the Caribbean. She knows that, management at Sandals know that, everyone in the Caribbean knows that, but who doesn't? We keep coming back to that big G. And so we have a system whereby we have a problem where we need to make that shift. But let me just say on the short term, I think one of our focuses has to be in getting this sort of narrative into the education curriculum. I think that now is the time, really, anyone coming out, going into first year of primary school really needs to start understanding how important the ocean economy is for us, because that is our reality. And I have to admit, I mean, I've gone through a lot of education. And it's only later on in life that I've really come to understand how important the ocean economy is for us here in the Caribbean. And that to really now understand and to say that we're really big ocean developing states rather than small island developing states. That has to be pushed, I think, at the curriculum from time as a child enters a school in any of our territories. They need to understand the mechanism and why this is so important for us. And I think that's how we're going to drive that groundswell, that change that is required. And it's going to take a generation for us to do it. But I think here are some small steps that we need to do along the way to get us to where we want to be. Because Heidi knows, Craig knows that if we don't do these things, we're all going to be in a terrible position in 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Thank you for that, Justin. Craig, if you wanted to come in, it'd be great to hear from you. Go ahead. Hear from you. I just want to say that we've had a couple of comments and questions coming in. Yosil is asking about financial mechanisms to make all of this happen. Maya is concerned about that, and others are concerned that people see the blue economy as a signal, as a green light to accelerate, for example, extractive industries in oil and gas. And Maya is asking, whether we shouldn't be having a moratorium, on that. And there's also a moratorium one earlier on. I think it's Vernon Barrett also talked about a moratorium on, on mangrove. Finally, Mulai actually raised this point, more than once. So I think it's important to recognize it. What is a platform? Do we have a permanent platform for the blue economy where we could bring, everyone together, on a more permanent basis? I think it's great in terms of what we're doing right now, and thanks to St. Lucia National Conservation Fund and also to the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. I also want to recognize the important work that Island Innovation has done in terms of bringing people together. But it's a good question, do we have some sort of a more permanent platform for the blue economy where we can, one, of course, with a platform, you can really get a groundswell of grassroots, support, and you can sort of bring in a whole range of players through their private sector, government, and so on. So those are some of the questions I think we need to answer. I think to wrap up the session, we have roughly 7 minutes left. Craig, over to you.
Sure. Just let me agree in terms of both Heidi and Dr. Ram's comments. And I think one of the things that I have to recognize is that messaging is important and people need to be convinced, whether you're at the government level or the grassroots level. And one of the ways that from my experience, I know that people become convinced is, for example, so just as I mentioned just now, that there are many things that we are doing now that could possibly be expanded or invested in or scale up so that people can be convinced that this is real, it does provide jobs, but there are also conservation benefits that we're looking for. Then Heidi, your idea of the marketing related to that, targeting not only private investment, how can a hotel or a tourism enhancement fund can support coastal communities in expanding Cmos farms or investing in honey production and so on and so forth. But the same marketing plan can include higher level conversations with international investors, with governments, putting together particular strategies for sector, tourism sector, agriculture. Now we talk about smart agriculture. All of these things are linked, but the important thing, I think both of you touched upon it, is the idea that the conversation and the dialogue must be such that it convinces people that this is important. And when we talk about a platform, again, can start with like the conversations that we're having now. I know that the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mayor Motley, has been emphasized and has been trying to cajole her colleagues into trying to do things differently. And I think because of the recognition that the time is now to do things differently, and there are successes out there that we can take and highlight and move forward. So let me say that I think the idea that investing right now in what has worked, being practical about it, analyzing it and see where it works. There's no one size fits all, but I think that there is merit in taking the time out to looking at the small successes and expanding them in a very broad way, putting on our considerable resources to supporting these, and bringing in the experts, whoever they may be, to helping us strategize, putting plans together to make it national and even perhaps regional.
Thank you very much for that, Craig. Folks, we're sort of coming to the end of our session, and we have a quick video to show. But I'd just like to sum up to highlight some of the key things that have been said. Basically, we're in a particularly tricky time for the Caribbean region, given the impact of the pandemic. We see that the blue economy can play a key role right now, both in terms of jobs, livelihoods, and diversifying our economy, but also has a critical role to play for the tourism industry as it comes back, for the fisheries industry as it comes back, other aspects of the blue economy, and of course for future generations. In order to harness that, we need to find ways to move away from existing models of sort of waiting for governments to take action. And we need to harness the power of the internet, perhaps through platforms like these or others. We need to harness the power of the internet to really get grassroots support, build a groundswell of support to moving things in the right direction, harnessing also the power of the private sector, in particular the tourism industry, which is a tremendous amount of influence as well, on government policy. So please join me in thanking, of course, our speakers earlier. Before I hand over to Yaba for the video, I'd like to thank very much our speakers, Craig, Heidi, Justin, for illuminating us on this conversation. Tremendous experience that you have, both in terms of working with NGOs and international agencies in the tourism and private sector, and at the policy level and economic levels. I think has not only illuminated us, but also inspired us to go forward. We've made some notes in terms of some of the great ideas coming out of this, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with the organizers, with you, Craig, with Yaba, Justin, Heidi, and others, so that this conversation, we're not having exactly the same conversation next year, but come next year, we can say, okay, remember we talked about that platform, remember we spoke about grassroots support, having an influence on government policy. Well, here's what we've done so far. So that is the commitment that I will give to this audience and to the speakers and organizers. And thank you for inviting us to chair this session. The Waitt Institute is very proud of our engagement with the Caribbean, and we're looking forward to fostering closer relations as we move forward. So Yaba, I'd now like to turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Angus, and thank you to all the panelists for this great session. We would actually like to end this session today on the blue economy, showing you a very short video of our co-hosts and co-organizers for this conference, the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, whose work is very much related to creating a thriving blue economy for St. Lucia, and hopefully that as an example for the rest of the region. We also invite you to join us for the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Expo, which is going to take place tomorrow, Thursday, where all the conservation trust funds that are part of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance architecture will be ready to talk with all of you. Thank you. Go ahead with the video.
The St. Lucia National Conservation Fund is committed to ensuring that conservation and nature-based solutions remain front and center of St. Lucia's development agenda. We know that much has been accomplished, but there is a lot more to be done. In conservation work, there is no finish line. The St. Lucia National Conservation Fund has been raising sustainable financing and making grants available. We are ready to support national conservation initiatives for the greater good.